Welcome to Evolved Sun. I'm your host, Matt Finch, and in today's episode, you're going to learn all about Jesus according to the raw material and the Law of One, which was a trans-channeling from the early 1980s. And I'm going to be using as a resource a channeling by the same people, L&L Research, that did the raw contact channeling. This was also channeled by Carla Rueckert, and instead of raw, this one was in 2003, and it was a channeling from Quo. And in this episode, I'm going to go in chronological order. So where I'm getting this first info from is the lawof1.info. This website is very, very organized, and it has all of the raw contact sessions 1 through 106. And there's also a way to organize it to go by the Law of One people, terms, and other types of categories. When I typed in Jesus, 19 results are found. So I'm going to read off the dialogue between the questioner, Don Elkins, and the social memory complex that calls themselves Ra, who is using Carla Rueckert as a trance channel to communicate through. She is the instrument in this channeling. And without further ado, let's get into it. I'll be referring to the questioner as Don and Ra as Ra. Don asks, "Can you tell me who, before incarnation into this density, was the one known as Jesus of Nazareth?" Ra says, "I have difficulty with this question as it is phrased. Can you discover another form for this query?" Don replies, "Yes. What I meant to say was, can you tell me if Jesus of Nazareth came from the Confederation before incarnation here?" Ra says, "The one known to you as Jesus of Nazareth did not have a name. This entity was a member of fifth density of the highest level of that sub-octave." There's also a asterisk next to the word fifth. "This entity was desirous of entering this planetary sphere in order to share the love vibration in as pure a manner as possible. Thus, the entity received permission to perform this mission. This entity was then a wanderer of no name, of Confederation origins, of fifth," another asterisk next to the word fifth, "density, representing the fifth density, understanding of the vibration of understanding or love." This time an asterisk next to the word density. And then below it corrects, it says, "This should be fourth." Ra corrects the error in the next answer. Don asks, "Did you say the fifth vibration was that of love? Fifth density was that of love?" Ra says, "I have made an error. The fourth density being is that which we intended to say. The highest level of fourth density going into the fifth. This entity could have gone on to the fifth, but chose instead to return to third for this particular mission. This entity was of the highest sub-octave of the vibration of love. This is fourth density." Alright, so from summing that up, that is why there, among the Law of One community and people that study this topic and this philosophy, why there seems to be some confusion regarding, well, was Jesus of Nazareth a fourth density wanderer or a fifth density wanderer? According to Ra, the entity that incarnated as Jesus into our third density experience here had recently become fifth density harvestable, so a graduate of the fourth density, the density of love or understanding. And while this entity could have gone into fifth density, the density of wisdom, it chose instead to incarnate on Earth, wandering into our third density as a graduate of the density of love to come bring to Earth and Earth's peoples teachings on how to graduate from third density. And that is to choose the way of love and acceptance. Don asks, "When Jesus of Nazareth incarnated, was there an attempt by the Orion group to discredit him in some way?" Ra says, "This is correct." So the Orion group is typically 4D negative, that's fourth density negatively polarized, entities of several different races and planets and star systems. The Orion Empire is service to self, and as Jesus was service to others, a lot of times these powerful Orion entities will seek out the most powerful wanderers from fifth, fourth, and sixth density and do what they can to prevent the service to others wanderer to having as big of an impact. Don asks, "Can you tell me what the Orion group did in order to try to cause his downfall?" Ra says, "We may describe in general what occurred. The technique was that of building upon other negatively oriented information. This information had been given by the one whom your peoples called Yahweh. This information involved many strictures upon behavior and promised power of the third density service to self nature. These two types of distortions were impressed upon those already oriented to think these thought forms. This eventually led to many challenges of the entity known as Jesus. It eventually led to one, sound vibration complex Judas, as you call this entity, who believed that it was doing the appropriate thing and bringing about or forcing upon the one you call Jesus, the necessity for bringing in the third density planetary power distortion of third density rule over others. This entity, Judas, felt that, if pushed into a corner, the entity you call Jesus would then be able to see the wisdom of using the power of intelligent infinity in order to rule others. The one you called Judas was mistaken in this estimation of the reaction of the entity Jesus, whose teach learning was not oriented towards this distortion. This resulted in the destruction of the bodily complex of the one known as Jesus to you. Don asks, then if the entity Jesus was fourth density, and there are wanderers on the planet today who came from fifth and sixth density, what was it that Jesus did that enabled him to be such a good healer? And could these fifth and sixth density beings here today do the same? Ra says, those who heal may be of any density which has the consciousness of the spirit. That includes third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. The third density can be one in which healing takes place just as the others. However, there is more illusory material to understand, to balance, to accept, and to move forward from. The gate to intelligent infinity can only be opened when an understanding of the instreamings of intelligent energy are opened unto the healer. These are the so-called natural laws of your local space-time continuum and its web of electromagnetic sources or nexi of instreaming energy. Know then, first, the mind and the body. Then as the spirit is integrated and synthesized, those are harmonized into a mind-body-spirit complex, which can move among the dimensions and which can open the gateway to intelligent infinity, thus healing self by light and sharing that light with others. True healing is simply the radiance of the self causing an environment in which a catalyst may occur, which initiates the recognition of self by self of the self-healing properties of the self. Don asks, how did Jesus learn this during his incarnation? Ra says, this entity learned the ability by a natural kind of remembering at a very young age. Unfortunately, this entity first discovered his ability to penetrate intelligent infinity by becoming the distortion you call angry at a playmate. This entity was touched by the entity known as Jesus to you and was fatally wounded. Thus, the one known as Jesus became aware that there dwelt in him a terrible potential. This entity determined to discover how to use this energy for the good, not for the negative. This entity was extremely positively polarized and remembered more than most wanderers do. Don asks, how did this aggressive action against a playmate affect Jesus in his spiritual growth? Where did he go after his physical death? Ra says, the entity you call Jesus was galvanized by this experience and began a lifetime of seeking and searching. This entity studied first day and night in its own religious constructs, which you call Judaism, and was learned enough to be a rabbi, as you call the teach learners of this particular rhythm or distortion of understanding, at a very young age. At the age of approximately 13 1/2 of your years, this entity left the dwelling place of its earthly family, as you would call it, and walked into many other places, seeking further information. This went on sporadically until the entity was approximately 25, at which time it returned to its family dwelling and learned and practiced the art of its earthly father. When the entity had become able to integrate or synthesize all experiences, the entity began to speak to other selves and learn what it had felt during the preceding years to be of an worthwhile nature. The entity was absolved karmically of the destruction of an other self when it was in its last portion of lifetime and spoke upon what you would call a cross, saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. In forgiveness lies the stoppage of the wheel of action, or what you call karma. Don asks, then in which density does the entity known as Jesus now reside? Ra says, this information is harmless, though unimportant. The entity studies now the lessons of the wisdom vibration, the fifth density, also called the light vibration. Don asks, in our culture, there is a great saying that he will return. Can you tell me if this is planned? Ra says, I will attempt to sort out this question. It is difficult. This entity became aware that it was not an entity of itself, but operated as a messenger of the one Creator whom this entity saw as love. This entity was aware that this cycle was in its last portion and spoke to the effect that those of its consciousness would return at the harvest. The particular mind-body-spirit complex you call Jesus is, as what you would call an entity, not to return, except as a member of the Confederation, occasionally speaking through a channel. However, there are others of the identical congruency of consciousness that will welcome those to the fourth density. This is the meaning of the returning. Don asks, I will ask you if you are familiar with the motion picture called the ninth configuration. Are you familiar with this? Ra says, we scan your mind complex and see this configuration called the ninth configuration. Don says, this motion picture brought out this point of which we have been talking, and the entity, the kernel, had to make a decision at that point. I was just wondering with respect to polarity, his polarization. He could have either knuckled under, you might say, to the negative forces, but he chose to defend his friend instead. Is it possible for you to estimate which is more positively polarizing? To defend the positively oriented entity, or to allow the suppression by the negatively oriented entities? Can you answer this even? Ra says, this question takes in the scope of fourth density as well as your own, and its answer may best be seen by the action of the entity called Jehoshua, which you call Jesus. This entity was to be defended by its friends. The entity reminded its friends to put away the sword. This entity then delivered itself to be put to the physical death. The impulse to protect the loved other self is one which persists through the fourth density, a density abounding in compassion. More than this, we cannot and need not say. Don asks, what was the orientation with respect to this type of communication for the one known as Jesus of Nazareth? Ra says, you may have read some of this entity's workings. It offered itself as teacher to those mind-body-spirit complexes, which gathered to hear, and even then spoke as through a veil, so as to leave room for those not wishing to hear. When this entity was asked to heal, it oft-times did so, always ending the working with two admonitions. Firstly, that the entity healed had been healed by its faith, that is, its ability to allow and accept changes through the violet ray into the gateway of intelligent energy. Secondly, always saying, tell no one. These are the workings which attempt a maximal quality of free will while maintaining fidelity to the positive purity of the working. Don says, an observation of the working itself by another entity would seem to me to partially abridge free will in that a seemingly magical occurrence had taken place as a result of the working of an adept. This could be extended to any phenomenon which is other than normally acceptable. Could you speak on this paradox that is immediately the problem of anyone doing healing? Ra says, we are humble messengers of the law of one. To us there are no paradoxes. The workings, which seem magical and, therefore, seem to infringe upon free will, do not, in themselves, do so. For the distortions of perception are as many as the witnesses, and each witness sees what it desires to see. Infringement upon free will occurs in this circumstance only if the entity doing the working ascribes the authorship of this event to its self or its own skills. Don asks, the one known as Jesus accumulated 12 disciples. What was his purpose in having these disciples with him? Ra says, what is the purpose of teach learning if there be no learned teachers? Those drawn to this entity were accepted by this entity without regard for any outcome. This entity accepted the honor duty placed upon it by its nature and its sense that to speak was its mission. Don says, the instrument asked the following question. Ra has implied that the instrument is on a path of martyrdom, but since all die, are we not all martyr to something? When, if ever, does martyrdom partake of wisdom? Quick little interjection here. The instrument Don is referring to is Carla Rueckert, and previously Ra had stated that she was on the path to martyrdom. Well, at least Ra had implied that. Ra says, this is a thoughtful query. Let us use as exemplar the one known as Jehoshua. This entity incarnated with the plan of martyrdom. There is no wisdom in this plan, but rather understanding and compassion extended to its fullest perfection. The one known as Jehoshua would have been less than fully understanding of its course had it chosen to follow its will at any space-time during its teachings. Several times, as you call this measure, This entity had the possibility of moving towards the martyr's place, which was, for that martyr, Jerusalem. Yet in meditation, this entity stated, time and time again, "It is not yet the hour." The entity could also have, when the hour came, walked another path. Its incarnation would then have been prolonged, but the path for which it incarnated somewhat confused. Thusly, one may observe the greatest amount of understanding, of which this entity was indeed capable, taking place as the entity in meditation felt and knew that the hour had come for that to be fulfilled which was its incarnation. It is indeed so that all mind-body-spirit complexes shall die to the third density illusion. That is, that each yellow-ray physical complex body shall cease to be viable. It is a misnomer to, for this reason alone, call each mind-body-spirit complex a martyr, for this term is reserved for those who lay down their lives for the service they may provide to others. We may encourage meditation upon the functions of the will. All right, and that concludes all the info on Jesus of Nazareth from the lawof1.info website. And again, that information we just covered came from the early 1980s in the raw material. Now let's move ahead and fast forward to 2003, December 6th, 2003, where LL Research, in the spirit of the season that they were entering, wanted some information on the entity known as Jesus the Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth. So here is Carla Rueckert channeling Quo. "We are those known to you as the principle of Quo, and we greet you in the love and the light of the one infinite Creator, in whose service we come to you. We thank you so much for calling us to your group by the intensity and the energy of your seeking. It is great blessing to us to be so called and to be allowed to offer you the humble service of sharing our thoughts and opinions with you. We are part of that confederation of entities whose only hope is to offer such thoughts to those who wish to accelerate the pace of their evolution of mind, body, and spirit at this time. We come in response to the cries of sorrow of the entities upon your planet, and we can only hope that our humble thoughts may open windows and let in some light and some air where perhaps there's been a darkness of thought. May we lighten it. This is our hope, to lighten, to energize, to enable those beautiful spirits to whom we speak today. We thank you for sacrificing the time and the attention of dedicating such a time to seeking, and we would ask only one thing of you in return, and that is that you listen to us with a great deal of discrimination, keeping those thoughts that you like and leaving the rest behind. You ask this day concerning the one known as Jesus. This entity has been known by several names. The name of his youth was Jehoshua. The name of Jesus is not that which this entity heard, unless it was spoken by those not of his own country, for that particular name is the Greek version of an Aramaic name. However, we shall call this entity Jesus, since that is the name under which each of you calls to him when you speak in your conversation with those entities you cannot see, but whose influence you certainly feel. The request from the one known as G was to speak concerning this entity's life. The life of the one known as Jesus was indeed somewhat unusual, and that the entity was an unusual being, sharing, in company with many of those within this circle and many those who call themselves wanderers, the facility of mind and the sharpness of intellect that enabled this entity, at a very young age, to be one who was intellectually able to study and to grasp abstract concepts in such a way that this entity was, by its very nature, prone to thinking upon the mysteries that it could not solve. The greatest mystery of all being that mystery of the lack of limit of the imagination. This infinity and eternity that the one known as Jesus felt within him pulled him ever forward. And being fortunate enough to dwell in what this instrument would call a small town, where his family had a humble but adequate home, and a community of those who could teach spiritual or religious subjects, the one known as Jesus was one who hung about such teachers, reading and asking questions and reading again. Until at a young age, as a teenager, this entity was considered a kind of rabbi. Along with the scholarly pursuits that this entity pursued as his principal hobby, the entity also spent many hours at the side of his father and his uncle, learning their trades and working with wood and gathering various herbs and those natural substances which were known to have healing benefits. The one known as Jesus tended to be somewhat of a loner and liked nothing better than to steal away at nightfall. There was, near the village in which his parents lived, a high place in the surrounding terrain. It was nothing more than what this instrument would call a knob, or a small rise of rock. Yet the climbing of this modest knob to the ridge of it created within him a feeling of peace that he did not find elsewhere. It was his habit to gaze at the stars and imagine the lack of limit. The overriding sense of infinite possibility would rest upon him at those times, and much of the actual substance of this entity's spiritual maturity was gained not because of the teaching of his parents or the teaching of those spiritual leaders which the small town offered, but rather the silence which he was able to find within himself while gazing into the depths of the night sky. At the age of approximately 14, this entity was offered the opportunity to study with two other entities from the same small town, who were also those who had an interest in the spiritual studies that the village rabbis were glad to offer. And so there ensued a period of some years where this entity studied, prayed, and meditated with a group of what this instrument would call Essenes. This further enabled the one known as Jesus to discipline his somewhat mischievous and wayward personality, and to refine within himself the hunger that he felt for the truth. Gradually, as he began to mature into an adult person, it came to him that he must travel, and so he began to walk upon a path that was as varied as his sense of each day's shape. He set off upon a pilgrimage, although the one known as Jesus certainly did not think in terms of such, but rather simply that he was called to the road, and guided by spirit and silence, he walked through parts of Africa and parts of India. Braving hunger and extremes of weather, the one known as Jesus walked many a weary mile and visited the campfires and the caves and the holy places of those who taught along the same lines as those he was taught and those who did not, learning always, accumulating wisdom and sifting it, winnowing it, and gradually coming into a fuller and fuller sense of who he was. Not as the one who had learned these things, but as the one who the witness of the process of that learning and its tumbling about and settling into those patterns of thought that he found truly helpful. It was during this phase that the one known as Jesus gradually became more and more aware of the shape of his future ministry. We give this instrument the image of mountains and sweet water and the name Kashmir as the furthest that this entity walked before he began the journey. Not precisely home, but the journey towards what this very dedicated entity felt was his future and his chosen ministry. While this entity had been traveling, one of this entity's relatives, the one known to this instrument as John the Baptist, had begun his own ministry, feeling under a real compulsion to purify himself and to allow to fall from himself all things that were not holy. The one known as John began to attract followers to himself with a very simple and direct message. The message of prophets from time immemorial: return to the Creator, cease from error, and serve only the highest and best. This entity had begun what he called baptism, the washing of the self in symbolic and ceremonial manner, in such a way that the water was seen as that emblem which washes away all sin. The power of this entity's purity and his charisma created an ever larger group of followers wherever this entity chose to appear from those reaches of the desert into which no one went. And it was at the place where the one known as John the Baptist was baptizing that the one known as Jesus found the inspiration to set a beginning and the beginning on his ministry. It is remarkable, given the fact that the one known as John was a family member, that this entity recognized in his cousin, the one known as Jesus, not a cousin, not a relative, but the Messiah, as he understood that term, the one who comes in the name of the Lord. A tremendous amount of power was transferred from John to Jesus and from Jesus to John at that time. It was truly a remarkable day, and one which may be seen to be the point at which the one known as Jesus moved from witness to actor, from being to doing, from potential to actual, from inner to outer. If we might, we would pause to note at this time the length of time that the one known as Jesus had walked through wilderness, talked to all those men of wisdom that he could find, and went through the purification of the pilgrimage, wherein there is no provision made for food or comfort, but only 2 feet upon a dusty road, and strangers at the end of the day. Such training is essential if one wishes to create the life which has depth and power. And this was done by the one known as Jesus, not because he felt it was right, but because the thirst and hunger for truth drew him ever onward, and the beauty of the search was irresistible, so that there was both the stick of this hunger and the carrot of the beauty of those spaces, within which he found himself able to occupy because of the long acquaintance with silence, the long discipline of the body, and the long times of listening both to others and to what they had to say, and the voice of his own thoughts. Indeed, it was mentioned by several entities in the conversation preceding this meditation that it is a very interesting thing simply to watch one's thoughts and to be aware of them as they arise, not to judge them, but to become aware of the content of the thought, especially those thoughts that repeat themselves. It is a process wherein one is able to go deeper and deeper within the self simply by careful observation. During this period, the one known as Jesus had for the most part kept himself apart from any personal relationships, either with men or with women. But certainly this entity was not without those men and women that he loved. The life of a wandering preacher is not a life which can easily be accommodating to a mate and a growing family, and it was the one known as Jesus's feeling that these were not pleasures of which he might partake. Consequently, for the most part, this entity held himself apart and was content to have unspoken yet very deep relationships with his mother, his brother, his cousin, and those disciples, both men and women, whose hearts he could see to be of that same thirst and hunger for truth that was his. Almost all of the writings concerning the one known as Jesus have to do with those stories that this teacher told during the 3 years or so of his active ministry. We do not find it possible with this instrument in a conscious state to move into such details as are perhaps wished for there is an intrinsic shallowness to such stories which, since this instrument has asked for a certain kind of contact, do not fall within the parameters of that contact. In terms of the essence or the gist of this entity's life, we might say that this entity was a sweet yet fierce entity by personality, ruthless in seeking, ruthless in self-observation, and gifted with the ability to grasp people's nature and, in some cases, even what they were thinking. This did not endear him to most people, for there is something frightening about an entity who can gaze not at you but into you, and so he was often an intimidating presence. Certainly those who were in the structure of authority in the religious life of the surrounding society found the entity more and more disturbing. In part, it is because this entity dwelt in a part of the world in which he was a marginal native, which is to say that he was dwelling close to a large number of those whom one could call Judeans or those of the tribe of Judah. This tribe happened to carry with it a very, shall we say, right-wing or conservative point of view in which a great deal of emphasis is placed upon the attitude of the body, the dress of the body, the proper ritual for each day and each hour of the day, and so forth. There was a feeling that these religious observances created a spiritually well-lived life, whereas, to the one known as Jesus' point of view, all of these rules and regulations were, far from being helpful, actually those things which obscured one's view of the Creator. This entity greatly wished for people to do precisely that which his cousin John suggested, to change their life as this instrument heard in the sermon at her religious observance this morning. That priest who offered these thoughts was saying that the term repent literally means to turn around, to turn the life around. This was the conclusion to which the one known as Jesus had come, that there was more to that metaphysical entity, which was called Israel, than the tribe of Judah. There was more to being a spiritual seeker than the outer forms. Naturally, since this entity had had years of training in mysticism and those practices of silence that mysticism encourages, he had little patience with those who identified spiritually with religious observance. Further, this entity, having been on the verge of big towns, not truly urban in nature and not truly those who wander the nomadic portions of his people, became convinced that his basic mission was to wake up all of the scattered tribes of Israel. This instrument has taken time to study, with the one she calls Papa, the makeup of these other tribes of the so-called nation of Israel. And working with this concept, this instrument discovered that the scattering of the tribes of Israel has resulted in not simply a large number of dispersed Jewish people, but rather those that have become the Orthodox Christians and the Protestant Christians, simply because of the pattern of their dispersal and because of the march of time and because of the march of Christian and world history. Therefore, it may be said honestly that the one known as Jesus, to a great extent, over a long period of approximately 2,000 years, has indeed had his message shared amongst all of those who were lost. And the message always remained simple, even when the one known as Jesus was in the most mortal crisis. what this entity did to position his disciples, those who were going to carry on after him, for their own teaching was to, as the one known as T said, use something very familiar. In this case it was not water, because there was not the water to drink with the meal, but rather the wine. But this entity chose to take meat and drink as symbols of his nature, and what this entity said was, "When you eat bread, remember me. When you drink wine, remember me." Again, the word remember, like the word repent, is key. To remember is to gather the members together. The one known as Jesus wished to gather all of those together who had come to learn and to serve in the grist mill of planet Earth. The one known as Jesus had an awareness that the time was short, that same awareness that you may see again and again whenever entities of great inspiration and purity have come to grips with the deeper tides of time and space. In the sense of actual time, 2,000 years does not seem to be a short time. Gazed at across the expanse of a cycle of time which is perhaps 75,000 years long, the last 2,000 years, the cycle of Pisces, indeed would seem a short time, especially because the one known as Jesus had, to some extent, developed the ability to work within what this instrument calls circular time, and so was aware both of linear time and that level of consensual reality that all here share, and also of the underlying reality of the inner planes, in which the end times, as this instrument is used to calling them, had already begun. Things occur within the inner planes long before they begin to appear within the physical planes. The roots of physical experience are often figured as a tree which grows in heaven and whose branches only reach the earth, so that things have already occurred in the root of the tree and in the trunk of the tree of destiny long before they appear as leaf and blossom upon the branches of consensus reality or physical life. This entity did not precisely see himself as Jesus the Christ, Son of God, that is preached by many, in that he saw himself as one who had emptied himself out in order that he might take on a larger persona. He saw it as the taking on of his life mission. He saw it as his acceptance of the return to the Father and his immolation of himself by the Father. He saw himself as that entity whose only desire was to fulfill those plans that he sensed the Father had. And indeed, it is notable that at one point he said to his disciples, "I have meat and drink that you know not of." And his disciples were puzzled because they had not given him any food. But he said to them, "My food is to do the will of the Father who sent me." Again, the figures of food and drink are used to indicate that which truly nourished this particular entity. This entity was not one who castigated himself or tried to beat down his human nature. Rather, he was one whose hunger for purity was such that he very much wanted and leapt towards the ability to lose himself, lose that ego structure, which would have its desires and wants apart from the will of the Father. To the one known as Jesus, all else was as nothing and simply was allowed to fall away. Not that this entity denied his roots, his past, and so forth, but that the entity had embraced a life which he saw truly as his destiny, and that destiny was only defined day by day. He could not know the will of the Father for any day but today. Thus the prayer which he taught focused upon one day, and asked certain simple things. Let earth be like heaven. Let us bring heaven to earth. Let all people take care of each other. Let people judge each other as they wish to be judged, and let all praise, glory, and power be given only to the Creator. These are some highlights, some notable parts of this entity's being that really stand out to us as we gaze at this entity's incarnation. The cloak of Christhood was not always light. The one known as Jesus suffered, and indeed laid his arms out upon that tree of which the one known as Dave Matthews sang, and gave up the life, the cloak, and all. As we gaze at that moment of sacrifice, we offer the words, "Not my will, but thine," to indicate the strength of this entity's dedication. It was not that he had no ego. It was not that he was not human. He had personality, humor, anger, all of the emotions. He was a normal entity, within the parameters of normalcy, shall we say. He was fortunate in his gifts and pure and thorough in his dedication. This entity informs us that we must move on, and so we do, but not without thanks to the one known as G for asking concerning this entity. Indeed, this entity's life is greatly to be admired and gazed upon through the smoky glass of imperfectly written and poorly remembered stories. Even the imperfections and distortions cannot hide that message of oneness, what this instrument would call the law of one, that he brought. Much has been said within this group and within your culture concerning that which this instrument calls the second coming. And we say to each of you, the cloak of Christhood is each entity's destiny. The walk from earth to heaven, from third density to fourth, is a walk that all shall take. Each has ego, each has personality, yet each has gifts and dedication, 2 feet and a dusty path. Blessings abound. The one known as Jesus was in no way aware of any cosmic past, or indeed the possibility of other worlds, or other entities upon other worlds. However, this entity was well trained as a mystic and had the sense of limitless space within. Alright, and that concludes this episode. I don't know about you, but I love learning about mystical Jesus. Yeah, and anyways, not much for me to say after that other than wow, wow, wow. Just phenomenal information. And we are so privileged, and I'm so grateful that this is available for us to learn about, read, online, and I love making these videos so more and more people can learn about it, deepen their knowledge of it, and so on and so forth. And with that being said, thanks so much as always, and take good care of yourself.